Mr. President, I rise this afternoon to speak about the legislation we're going to be voting on later today, including an amendment that I have, and it has to do with the Crime Victims Fund. And I just want to explain and remind my colleagues of just how important the Crime Victims Fund is. This is a very, very major funding source for people who do some of the most important work in America. I know, I've met these folks. I have toured their facilities all across Pennsylvania. And I'm referring to the advocates for victims of crimes. And these advocates, my goodness, the heinous and horrendous crimes that they guide people's recovery. I'm at a loss for words to describe what these folks do for often children, often very vulnerable people who are victims of these heinous crimes. Well, thank God there are people who dedicate their lives, professionals who dedicate their lives to helping people with their recovery, to helping people who are victims to cope with what can be horrific reliving of the experience when they have to recount it to law enforcement or go through physical exams and on and on. It's very, very difficult work, and it's very, very important to help completely innocent victims get through what is undoubtedly about the worst experience in their lifetime. So the Crime Victims Fund provides resources for the people who help the victims of crime and for victims themselves. It's important to point out that the fund is funded entirely by the proceeds from criminal penalties. There's no taxpayer money in this fund, never has been. It's entirely from criminal penalties. And there's a statute that created this account at the federal government that requires the money that goes into it, these criminal penalties, to go to the victims and their advocates. But it doesn't say when the money has to go. And so that gave rise to a serious problem that developed. For years, it turns out, money that was put into this fund, money from criminal penalties that went into the Crime Victims Fund, didn't go to the victims, didn't go to the advocates for victims. It was intentionally withheld because we had these crazy budget rules that created an incentive to withhold it. The way the budget rules worked is if there was money in the fund that did not go to the victims of crime and their advocates as it's supposed to, under the budget rules, you could pretend that that was a savings and it would therefore allow you to spend more money in other areas. It was effectively a way to circumvent spending caps. And that's how it was used. Year in and year out, money was systematically withheld from victims of crime and their advocates, and it was a big problem. Give you a sense of scale. In 2014, for instance, only $745 million was obligated, despite a balance of $9 billion. So you had over $8 billion in funding that was supposed to go to crime victims and their advocates, intentionally withheld. 2013, only $730 million was obligated out of a little over $8 billion balance. There was over $7 billion intentionally withheld. From 2001 to 2014, the value of the fund, the money going in, increased by almost 600%, funding for victims of crime and their advocates. That increased by 39%. Mr. President, this was wrong. It was an abuse. It's based on an arcane and ridiculous budget rule, and it had a very, very deleterious effect. So when I discovered this, I began fighting this aggressively. It was brought to my attention by the people who serve victims of crime. These groups came to me and asked me to help them in the struggle for them to get the resources they needed to meet the unmet needs of victims of crime all over my state, and I'm sure all over the country. For instance, in 2015, the National Children's Alliance sent me a letter, and they said, and I quote, "The Crime Victim Fund's caps have been set too low. Deposits," meaning the criminal penalties going into the fund, deposits have skyrocketed while disbursements have remained almost flat. We look forward to further working with you to make all the statutory changes needed to update the VOCA Crime Victims Fund, and in turn better meet the needs of all victims and survivors of crime. In 2016, the court-appointed special advocates wrote, and I quote, "Since 2000, when Congress began capping disbursements from the Crime Victims Fund to prevent fluctuations in deposits, funding has not kept pace with the needs of victims, including the growing population of child victims in America." End quote. In 2015, I got a letter from the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and they said, and I quote, "The most frustrating thing for someone who has done policy work is that there is money available for these unmet needs," end quote. Well, that's all true, Mr. President. There was money available. It was because money was deposited into the fund. It was just being systematically withheld from the victims of crime and their advocates. But I got the message, and I think these folks were exactly right. And so in response to these groups, I began working closely with appropriators on both sides of the aisle to address this problem. Worked extensively with Senator Shelby and his staff. And the fact is, since about 2015, appropriators, the folks who control the effective allocation of this, have voluntarily obligated appropriate levels of disbursement since 2015. And the chart illustrates this very clearly. Prior to 2015, the green line, everything to the left of the green line is prior to 2015. And you see these very, very low levels, less than $1 billion every year, despite huge amounts of money being poured in. And then afterwards, starting in 2015, large increases in disbursements from the fund. Very, very important. This has changed the circumstances for advocates of crime. They've grown enormously. I know this. In Pennsylvania, they've been able to hire more counselors. They've been able to open more facilities to treat and to help these victims of crime. This is tremendous progress. But there's no guarantee that it's going to continue. So I've sought to make this simple principle, the idea that the money flowing into the fund should also flow out of the fund to the victims. I've tried to make this a permanent arrangement. Now, let me be very clear. This is not, I'm not trying to change budget rules. I'm not trying to, reopen some general budget. This is one egregious example of a category of budget flaws, and I'm not trying to change that. I'd love to change that. I should qualify that. I am trying to change it in other venues, but not here, not today. Today, all I'm trying to do is something very, very narrow and very specific, and that is make sure that victims of crimes and their advocates get the money they're supposed to get. It's really and truly as simple as that. Now, I've introduced legislation to do just this repeatedly, legislation that would simply require that we appropriate the appropriate dollar amounts each year. It was reported favorably out of the Senate Budget Committee. In 2015, it was unanimously adopted in a bipartisan Congressional Budget Act of 2019. So there's broad bipartisan support for this idea, but we've never been able to get it across the finish line. Again, I'm not trying to change all the budget rules, just this one fund. I just want to make sure that crime victims get the money that the statute says they're supposed to get. The senator from Illinois, I believe, is the senator who has introduced legislation that would create a new category of resources for the Crime Victims Fund. And that is specifically to add deferred and non-deferred prosecution agreement payments to the Crime Victims Fund. So it wouldn't be just criminal judgments, it would also be these prosecution agreements. I fully support that money going into the Crime Victims Fund. It's a new, important source of revenue that can help to serve these victims of crime. There's no tax dollars involved. I support this goal. I support this legislation. I just want to make sure that we don't go back to these days that weren't so terribly long ago when money going into the fund stayed in the fund because it served people's purposes. And that's the problem I have with the underlying legislation in its current form. That legislation has no requirement whatsoever that any increase in funding will actually be matched by an increase in outflows for victims and their advocates. You see, making the fund bigger doesn't by itself guarantee there will be any more money for victims of crime or their advocates. Ensuring that money goes into the fund is just not enough. We saw this. We need to ensure that more money is actually leaving the fund and going to victims, not remaining unspent so as to offset some other category of spending, who knows what. I was appreciative back in 2018 for the endorsement from the National Organization for Victim Assistance, who wrote, and I quote, "A permanent solution is needed. There is no mechanism to stop Congress from diverting money from victims in the future, should it choose to do so," end quote. Well, my amendment solves this problem. It's very simple. It would just require a reasonable minimum level for victims and advocates based on the amounts that have been deposited into the Crime Victims Fund from both of the sources. As I say, Congress has been adhering to this voluntarily since 2016. What my amendment would do is it would simply create a point of order. If legislation came to the floor that violated this principle and that went back to these days of withholding, intentionally withholding money that should be going to victims of crime, well, then that legislation would be subject to a point of order. Now 60 senators could override that point of order, but at least it would create the presumption and an incentive for appropriation legislation to actually provide the funding to victims and their advocates that it's supposed to. And I should also be clear, the policy only creates a spending floor. It would be at the discretion of appropriators first and Congress as a whole later to decide if they wanted to disperse more money than what the law contemplates, but the floor would at least prevent the worst of these abuses. So you can imagine my surprise when some of the folks who are big advocates for putting more money into the fund are adamantly opposed to my language that would actually require that money to also come out of the fund and go to the intended beneficiaries. You have to ask yourself, why would someone oppose such a requirement? And it's hard not to think that maybe one of the reasons that some people are adamant that they not be required to actually disperse this money is maybe they're thinking about going back to what used to happen routinely around here. Remember, if the money is withheld from victims, if we go back to when the money didn't make it out the door to victims, why that amount that is withheld can be spent on other things. And that is a powerful incentive for a lot of folks around here. You can see how it was done. Now, I've heard people say, some of my opponents say, don't worry, we have no intention of diverting any of this money. Trust us, they say. If they have no intention of diverting the money, then why are they so adamant that they not be required to disperse it to its intended beneficiaries? Well, we don't really have to speculate anymore because the President of the United States, President Biden, has been very clear about his intentions. In his budget, he's explicitly called for withholding this money from victims. It's right here in black and white. This isn't, you don't have to be creative here. You don't have to be conspiratorial. The President has declared to the world in a published budget that he wants to withhold the money from crime victims. And in fact, he's laid it out there. It's in table S8 of his budget. So I think this is a well-founded concern that we might go back to that practice. And in any case, if nobody wants to go back to that practice, then why wouldn't they agree to a requirement that this money actually be dispersed? Now, over the course of debating this, much has been made of a letter that's been signed by some victims' organizations. Let's look at this for what it is. Organizations that depend overwhelmingly on congressional appropriations are asked to sign a letter by the very people who control whether or not they get funding, and the letter is advocating against codifying a stable increased funding that would benefit those folks. I think we know what's going on there. I want to thank the many groups that are supporting this amendment: the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Heritage Action, Freedom Works, the R Street Institute, Taxpayer Protection Alliance, Americans for Prosperity, and others. But folks, this isn't complicated. And it isn't about overhauling budget rules, and it isn't about anything that's terribly complicated or arcane. It's about ensuring that crime victims and their advocates get the money they're supposed to get. So I urge my colleagues to stand with me, support this amendment, and make sure that the neediest and some of the most vulnerable among us, victims of crime, receive the increased funding they deserve.